It was October 2013 when I decided to spend a week alone at a hunting cabin in northern Wisconsin. I was 36 back then, working construction most of the year, and the season had just wrapped up. The job was decent, paid the bills, but it burned me out. Every year I took the same week off to clear my head, away from town, away from people. I'd load up my truck with gear, food, a couple jugs of water, my rifle, and head for the trees. This time, I picked a spot about 20 miles outside of Glidden. My buddy's uncle had a cabin out there he said I could use. Old, nothing fancy, no power or plumbing, but it had a working wood stove and a good roof. I left early on a Monday morning. Sun still low behind the trees, the air sharp and dry. Took me around 4 hours to get to the last turnoff. Then another hour creeping down a narrow, rutted-out fire road that felt like it hadn't seen a vehicle all year. Pines crowded tight on either side, the road barely wide enough for my truck. I kept the windows cracked a bit even though it was cold. Liked to smell the forest as I got closer. When I pulled up, the cabin looked just like I expected. Small, square, dark with siding turned gray from years of weather. One little porch out front, some old furniture leaning against the side. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and looked around. No sound except wind moving through the branches. No houses nearby, no other hunters, no roads. Just trees, brush, and quiet. I liked it that way. Inside was a bit dusty, smelled like dry wood and rodent droppings, but not bad. One room with a cot against the far wall, a rust-stained sink that didn't work, a shelf stacked with old cans, and the stove in the corner. There was an axe leaning against the wall, and a few logs stacked up beside it. The place hadn't been used much, but it was solid. I unpacked, cracked open a window, started sweeping out dead leaves and mouse poop, got a small fire going in the stove, then walked the perimeter with my rifle. The area around the cabin was thick with trees and brush, but I found a few clearings and game trails. I marked spots with bright tape so I wouldn't get lost. I wasn't looking for trophy bucks, just a decent-sized deer to fill my freezer. I'd spent the last few months checking over my rifle, re-zeroing the scope, making sure I was set. I was ready. That first night, I sat on the porch wrapped in a jacket and watched the sun go down. The forest turned black quick once the light dipped behind the trees. I had a little battery lantern and a headlamp, but I didn't like to use them much. The dark didn't bother me. I'd grown up in northern Minnesota before moving south, and we were always outside at night as kids. You get used to the dark. The first 2 days went about how I expected. I scouted, sat in blinds, tracked prints. Weather was cold and dry with frost most mornings. I saw signs, tracks, droppings, a couple rubs on trees, but no deer. I hiked a lot farther than I planned, sometimes a few miles out, but always made sure to head back by mid-afternoon. I wasn't trying to be out in the dark with a rifle and a full pack. One morning, might have been Wednesday, I found something strange. I was following a ridge that dropped off into a narrow draw, and I noticed something metallic half-buried near a dead log. I brushed off the dirt and leaves, and saw it was an old trail cam, busted and covered in rust. It looked like it had been smashed, cracked casing, bent bracket. I figured it had been out there a long time, probably from another hunter who forgot it. What caught me was the wire. The camera had a piece of thick wire running from the back into the ground, like someone had tried to hide it. I tugged it up. It wasn't electrical, just some kind of heavy cable, frayed in spots, running off under the leaves. I followed it maybe 10 feet before it just ended, clean cut like with bolt cutters. It didn't sit right with me. I left it alone and moved on, but I kept thinking about it. That night, something woke me up. I'd fallen asleep around 9 p.m., dead tired from hiking all day. The stove was burning low, casting dim orange light across the room. I heard a sound light but sharp, not like wind, more like someone stepping on something brittle outside. I sat up slowly, heart kicking up a bit. I stayed still, listened. Nothing, just the wind again. I got up, grabbed my rifle, and stepped to the door. I opened it quietly, stared into the trees. Nothing moved. No eye shine, no motion. I stood there a few minutes, then went back in and stuffed the stove with more wood. I stayed up longer than I should have, just watching the door. The next morning, I saw something odd near the path I used to go out scouting. There were boot prints, not mine, different tread, deeper than mine, wider too. They came in from the trees on the east side, crossed the trail, and vanished into the underbrush heading south. I checked my own boots against them. Mine were smaller and the soles didn't match. I didn't like that. I hadn't seen another sole since I arrived, and this wasn't a public area. I tried not to let it get to me. People wander, sure. Could be an old hunter. Could be someone passing through. I kept hunting, but I started staying closer to the cabin. Every night after that, I heard movement outside. Never close, always out in the trees. Sticks breaking, dry leaves crunching. I didn't sleep much, just lay there, rifle on my chest, listening. On Friday, I made the mistake of going too far. I spotted a doe in the distance around noon and followed her trail through a mess of thick brush and rock. I lost track of time. The light started fading before I realized how far I'd gone. When I checked my watch, it was past 5:30 p.m., and I was at least 2 miles from the cabin. I booked it back, stumbling in places, cutting through brush, scraping my legs and arms. The woods got dark fast, and I ended up relying on my headlamp for the last mile. I was sweating by the time I saw the roof of the cabin through the trees. I stopped short, my chest tightening. There was smoke coming out of the chimney. I hadn't lit the stove since that morning. I stood there frozen, eyes locked on the faint wisp rising into the cold air. The only light was from the stove glow inside. No lanterns, no other lights. I backed off, moved to the side, crouched behind a tree. My truck was untouched. No tire marks, no signs of a break-in. But someone was inside. I stayed low, circled wide, keeping my eyes on the windows. I didn't see movement, but I knew I couldn't just walk in. I waited there for hours, freezing, watching. Around midnight, the glow faded. Smoke stopped. No one came out. Nothing moved. I made the call to move in slowly, rifle up, safety off. I pushed the door open. No one inside. The stove had been used, fresh ash, warmth still coming off the metal. But nothing else looked touched. My gear was where I left it. Food, pack, boots. But something felt off. The cot had been sat on. My lantern was in a different spot. One of the water jugs had been moved. I stayed up the rest of the night, every muscle tight, waiting for a sound, a shadow, something. But nothing came. Saturday, I packed everything by first light. I didn't wait. I shoved my gear into the truck, left the cabin as is, and drove out fast. The road felt longer going out. Every curve, every blind bend, I expected someone to be standing there. But I didn't see a soul. When I got back to town, I called my buddy and told him what happened. He didn't say much, just that his uncle hadn't been out there in years. I didn't press it. A week later, I checked my truck. There were muddy prints on the back bumper. Big ones, the kind that don't match my boots. I haven't been back since. It was September 2021. I was 32 years old and needed a break from the chaos of Atlanta. The previous few months had drained me completely. Work, bills, my car breaking down twice, and a failed relationship that left me hollow. My cousin, Nate, had a cabin he barely used up in Tennessee, not far from the North Carolina border. It was tucked into a quiet patch of forest about an hour from any decent-sized town. I remembered it from when we were younger. A modest wooden structure, nothing fancy, but quiet and surrounded by thick trees and little else. I called him and asked if I could stay there for a while to clear my head. He didn't hesitate, told me where the key was hidden, reminded me to bring my own supplies, and warned me that the solar setup wasn't perfect. I packed up 2 weeks' worth of food, water, clothes, and gear and left on a Tuesday morning. The drive took 5 hours. The last stretch was rough. Winding mountain roads, no cell signal, and not a single car passing me. I followed his directions and pulled onto a narrow dirt trail that wound deep into the forest. I drove for maybe another 15 minutes before I saw the clearing. There it was, just like I remembered it. Weathered wood, green metal roof, a narrow front porch with 2 old chairs leaning against the railing. and a shed sitting about 30 feet off to the side. I parked the car, got out, and just stood there for a few minutes. It was dead quiet. No wind, no birds, just that stillness that makes you feel like you're somewhere you shouldn't be. But I liked it. It felt like the kind of silence I needed. I found the key in the spot Nate told me about, taped under one of the porch boards. Inside, the place was exactly how you'd picture a cabin in the woods. Dusty wood floors, a stone fireplace, a single couch, small table, and a kitchen that ran on propane. There was one bedroom and a bathroom with a composting toilet and a rainwater-fed sink. Rustic, but not uncomfortable. I unpacked and settled in fast. That first day was peaceful. I read for a few hours, took a nap, walked a bit around the property, and even made a fire in the outdoor pit after the sun started going down. There were no nearby houses, no roads, and no lights. The sky lit up with more stars than I'd seen in years. The first night passed without anything strange. I slept well despite the distant sound of owls and small things rustling in the trees. On the second day, I chopped some firewood and cleared out some brush from around the shed. I found a trail Nate had told me about in the woods, not more than a deer path, but I followed it for an hour before turning back. Still peaceful, still quiet. That night was when things started to feel different. I woke up sometime after midnight. I don't wear a watch to bed, but I could tell it was late by how dark the room was. The cabin had no central heating, just the fireplace and an old propane wall heater I hadn't turned on. The air felt cold. Not the kind of cold that wakes you up, though. It was the silence, the complete absence of sound. You don't notice how much noise the woods make until they stop. No wind, no owls, no bugs, just complete, dead silence. I sat up in bed and just listened. My heart was already beating a little faster, but I told myself it was nothing. Just my brain playing tricks. Sometimes the woods go quiet. Maybe a predator was passing through. I lay back down and tried to sleep again. Then I heard the knock. It wasn't loud, just one solid knock, like someone hit the wooden wall once, near the back of the cabin. I froze. My mind scrambled for logic. Could a branch have fallen? Maybe an animal bumped into the wall? I stayed frozen for maybe 5 minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I drifted off again, more from mental exhaustion than anything else. When I woke up, I went outside to check. There was no sign of anything near the back wall. No footprints, no fallen branches, just dirt and leaves. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I didn't go back down the trail or work on anything. I just kept scanning the trees, constantly feeling like something was just out of sight. Around late afternoon, I forced myself to shake it off. "You're here to relax," I said to myself. I made dinner and sat out on the porch until the sun dropped below the trees. But when the dark settled in, that feeling came back. The pressure in my chest, like something wasn't right. I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, I swore I heard soft crunching outside, like something walking in the leaves. Once I thought I saw movement through the curtain by the front window, just a shadow, but maybe it was the trees swaying, or maybe not. On the fourth day, I found the footprints. I'd gotten up early, hoping to just start the day and push the anxiety away. I walked around the side of the cabin where the fire pit was, and I noticed something in the soft dirt. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were different, bigger than mine and deeper. Heavy boots, the kind with thick treads. They came from the woods behind the cabin, walked in a slow curve toward the shed, then disappeared back the way they came. I followed them for a while, maybe 50 yards into the woods, until I lost them in the dry leaves. I stood there, turning in circles, straining my ears. Still nothing. I went back, locked the door, and didn't leave the cabin the rest of the day. That night, the knocking came back. Twice. One knock, then silence. 10 minutes later, 2 knocks. Pause between them. I didn't sleep. I stayed in bed, heart racing, clutching the knife I kept near my gear bag. I had no gun, just that knife and a can of bear spray. I stayed like that until sunrise. When light finally crept in through the cracks in the curtains, I stepped outside. I didn't find any new footprints, but the shed door was open. It hadn't been the day before. I hadn't touched the shed since I arrived. Inside, the shelves were undisturbed, the tools all where they should be. But in the back corner, I found something that hadn't been there before. A crumpled snack wrapper and an old plastic bottle of water, the kind you'd buy from a gas station. It wasn't mine. I locked the shed and walked the perimeter again. This time, I saw faint footprints circling around to the bedroom window. They weren't deep like the first set, just enough to tell someone had passed there. That was the last straw. I packed my gear. Took an hour. I kept checking the woods every 5 minutes. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I got in the car and drove out of there without stopping. Back in Atlanta, I called Nate. I didn't tell him everything, just that I felt uneasy there, that someone might have been squatting in the woods. He said he'd go check on it next time he was up there, but I could hear in his voice he didn't really believe me. A few days later, I got a call from him. He said someone had broken into the shed again. The lock was broken this time. A few tools were missing, including an axe. He also found a pile of old food cans in the woods about 100 yards out, half buried near the base of a tree, like someone had been camping out there, watching. He called the sheriff's department, but they didn't find anyone. No signs of a camp, no gear left behind, just the cans. I never went back to that cabin. Nate ended up selling it the next summer. Said he didn't want to deal with it anymore. To this day, I don't know who was out there or how long they'd been watching. Maybe it was just some drifter, maybe someone with worse intentions. All I know is that every night I was there, I felt them getting closer, testing the edges, waiting for the right moment. I was lucky I left when I did. And now, whenever someone says they want to get away from it all, I tell them to think twice about where they go. Sometimes you're not as alone as you think. My name is Jeremy Moore. This happened in the fall of 2016, when I was 34. Back then, I was living in northern Arkansas, outside a small town called Jasper. I worked a dull job at a hardware distribution warehouse, night shifts mostly, and lived alone in a rented duplex near the edge of town. I'd always liked being alone. Most of the time, I'd keep to myself and go fishing or hiking on weekends, and I didn't really bother much with other people. That year, I'd been going through a rough stretch. My younger brother, Chris, had died in a motorcycle accident earlier that spring, and I hadn't been right in the head since. He was all I had left in terms of family. Our parents had both passed years ago, one from cancer, the other from a heart attack, and Chris and I had been close, even if we didn't talk all the time. After the funeral, I shut myself off from everyone and started drinking a little more than I should have. Most nights I was numb, and most mornings I didn't feel like facing anything. That fall, I decided I needed to get away for a while. Just a couple days, nothing major. I didn't want to see people, hear traffic, or deal with anything connected to normal life. I remembered this old family property we used to visit as kids. My great-uncle's cabin out by an abandoned cemetery in Newton County, about an hour and a half from where I lived. The cabin had been unused for a long time, probably 15 years or more. It was small, one-story, with a tin roof and wood walls so old they were gray with age. The cemetery behind it was older than the cabin itself. I think it dated back to the late 1800s. There were maybe 24 graves, all crooked and faded, covered in vines and dead leaves. Most of the headstones were broken or unreadable. It was the kind of place people didn't go near anymore. I remembered being scared of it when I was young. My brother and I used to dare each other to run through the graveyard at night. I think once we even camped out there with a couple flashlights and a six-pack of soda. I figured the place would still be standing, and if it wasn't, well, I'd find somewhere nearby to set up my tent. I didn't need much. I loaded up my truck with a cooler of food, a few old camping supplies, some water, extra blankets, a rifle just in case, and a small gas-powered generator I'd borrowed from a coworker. I didn't plan on using it unless I really needed to, but I figured it couldn't hurt. I left town just after sunrise one Thursday and made it to the old dirt road by 9 a.m. It took another 25 minutes of slow driving to reach the gate that led to the cabin path. The gate was barely still upright, rusted and crooked, half buried in brush. I parked beside it and hiked the last quarter-mile in. It looked mostly like I remembered. The woods were thicker than they used to be, with years of unchecked growth swallowing the old trail, but I could still see the outline of the cabin roof through the trees. There were no signs of anyone having been out there recently. No tire tracks, no footprints, no beer cans or fire rings. Just nature. It was quiet in the kind of way that makes your ears ring a little. The cabin was rough. Some of the boards on the outside walls were splitting, and the front steps sagged under my weight when I stepped up to the door. It was still unlocked. We never used to lock it. Inside was dusty and smelled like mold, but nothing had been vandalized or broken. There were still a couple old metal bed frames, a wood stove, a few chairs, a rickety table, and a rusted lantern sitting on the shelf. I cleaned up a little, swept out leaves and dead bugs, and opened the windows to let air in. By late afternoon, I had the place set up with my sleeping bag rolled out on one of the old beds and the generator hooked up outside in case I wanted to charge my phone or plug in a lamp. Behind the cabin, the cemetery was just like I remembered, maybe even worse. Most of the headstones had fallen or been overtaken by weeds. Some were nothing but rounded rocks at this point. There was no fence around it, just a slight clearing where the trees thinned out, and a stretch of cracked earth where roots had pushed the ground upward in strange shapes. I stood there a long time just looking. I don't know why. Something about it felt heavier than it used to. That night, I made a small fire out front and ate a can of chili. I didn't bother with the generator. I sat there in the dark, sipping from a flask, listening to the wind push through the trees. The sky was clear and full of stars. For a while, it was peaceful. I didn't think about work or bills or my brother, just the night, the fire, and the woods. But around midnight, I started hearing something strange. At first, it was nothing more than a couple snapping branches. I figured it was a deer. Then I heard a long scraping sound, like wood dragging across stone. I stood up and listened, but it was gone. I walked around the cabin with my flashlight, but I didn't see anything. The fire was burning low, and the woods were quiet again. Still, something felt off. I went inside, locked the door out of habit, and got in my sleeping bag. I left the flashlight next to me, just in case. Took a while, but I eventually drifted off. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the leaves outside. They were soft, slow, deliberate. Not animal footsteps, human ones. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped on the side near the old woodpile. I heard something shuffle, maybe someone kneeling down or leaning against the wall. Then silence. I sat up and grabbed the rifle. I didn't turn on the flashlight yet. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I sat there in the dark, breathing slowly, straining to hear anything else. But there was nothing, not even crickets. Just still air and the faint creak of old wood settling. After what felt like an hour, I got up and peeked through the front window. The moon was bright enough that I could see the clearing, but there was nothing there. I went back to bed eventually, but never really fell back asleep. The next morning, I walked the whole area around the cabin. I didn't find any footprints, but the ground was hard and dry, so it didn't surprise me. I still had that weird feeling in my stomach, like someone had watched me all night. I told myself it was just nerves or maybe a nightmare. I forced myself to ignore it. That day, I spent a couple hours chopping firewood, eating, and walking through the woods. I found a creek about a quarter-mile down the ridge and followed it for a while. It was good to move, made me feel more grounded. But I kept thinking about the night before, about the steps, about how quiet it had gotten. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't before. Near the edge of the graveyard, behind a row of old headstones, there was a hole. Not a grave, not even a proper pit. Just a shallow dugout spot, maybe 2 feet deep, a few feet long. The dirt was piled off to one side, and the leaves around it had been cleared. It looked recent. No tools nearby, no tarp, just an open patch of turned soil behind the farthest gravestone. I walked over and stood beside it for a while, There were no footprints there either, but again, the ground was dry. The hole didn't make sense. It wasn't big enough for a body, and it didn't look like an animal had dug it. It looked purposeful, but not finished. I didn't know what to think. I walked away and tried to ignore it, but all day I felt uneasy. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder, listening for something that wasn't there. That night, I didn't start a fire. I stayed inside with the rifle loaded, sitting near the window. Around 11:30 p.m., I heard a noise near the cemetery. It wasn't footsteps this time, it was metal clinking, like a shovel hitting rock. I killed the lantern and watched from the window, heart pounding. I couldn't see anything, just dark shapes and moonlight. I stepped out onto the porch, slow and quiet, holding the rifle in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I didn't turn on the light. The noise stopped. I waited 5 minutes, maybe 10. Nothing moved. Then I turned on the flashlight and swept it across the graveyard. The hole was deeper now. Someone had been working on it, and leaning against one of the gravestones was a shovel. Not one I brought. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. No movement, no sound, just the wind picking up again. I backed into the cabin, locked the door, and sat down in the dark. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun came up, I went out to look at the graveyard again. The shovel was still there. It was old, rusted, wooden handle cracked near the top. The hole was now about 3 feet deep, and there were fresh marks in the dirt where someone had dug during the night. Still no footprints, no tire marks, nothing. I packed my stuff. Whatever the hell was going on out there, I wanted no part of it. I tossed the food and the gear back in the truck and hiked back to the gate. As I drove back into town, I kept thinking about how quiet it had been, how no animals had made noise, how there were never any signs of who was out there. A week later, I called the county sheriff's office and asked, casually, if they'd gotten any complaints or reports about strange activity out by the old cemetery off County Road 76. The woman on the phone said no, not in years. She asked if I wanted to file a report, and I said no. I just hung up. A month later, I drove. It was one of those days where everything felt a little off from the start. I had just turned 34, and my life seemed to be stuck in this perpetual loop of work, home, sleep, and repeat. So, when the opportunity came to take a weekend trip to a remote cabin, I didn't hesitate. I was living in Montana at the time, a small town near Bozeman, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. And the only real danger is the occasional grizzly sighting or a moose wandering into someone's yard. This cabin wasn't anything special, nothing like the luxury ones you see in magazines. It was a small, wooden place tucked into the thick of the forest, about an hour's drive from town. A friend of mine, Kyle, had inherited it from a distant relative and invited me out to spend the weekend. No real plans, just some time to relax, get away from the chaos, and unwind. The drive to the cabin was uneventful, just winding roads cutting through tall pine trees, the mountains rising up on all sides. The air was fresh, crisp, and cold. Early spring still, with snow still clinging to the higher elevations, but it was warm enough down below that you didn't need a jacket unless the wind picked up. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip behind the mountains. It was smaller than I expected. One story with a peaked roof, a few windows, and a porch that looked like it had been built decades ago. The wood was weathered, the paint chipped in places. It looked like something out of an old Western film. Kyle wasn't there yet, which I wasn't surprised by. He had said he'd be coming up later that evening. I had the place to myself for the time being. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of old wood and dust filling my nose. Inside, the cabin was just as basic as it appeared from the outside. Wooden floors, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a couple of worn couches by the window. There was a small bedroom in the back with a bed that looked like it might collapse under too much weight. The only light came from a few bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting long, faint shadows on the walls. I threw my stuff down and checked the place out. The windows were covered with thick curtains, probably to keep the cold out in the winter months. The place felt lived in, but not well taken care of. There was an odd silence to it, like the kind of silence you only get in the middle of nowhere. It felt strange, but not exactly unsettling. After a few minutes, I decided to head out for a walk. The woods around the cabin were dense, the trees stretching high above me like an endless sea of green. I needed to stretch my legs, to breathe in the quiet. My footsteps crunched on the leaves and twigs as I made my way down a narrow path, keeping my eyes peeled for any wildlife. I'd heard there were bears in the area, but I didn't think much of it. It was still early in the season for them to be active. The further I walked, the more isolated it felt. It was almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you start listening too hard for any sound that isn't your own breathing. It wasn't until I'd been walking for maybe an hour that I noticed something strange. In the distance, off to my left, through the trees, there was a small clearing. I passed it on my way out, but hadn't paid attention to it then. Now, something about it stood out. I felt drawn to it, so I turned off the trail and made my way through the brush toward the clearing. As I got closer, I realized there was a small, dilapidated shed at the edge of it. It was barely visible from the trail, hidden by the thick undergrowth. The roof was sagging, and the walls were covered in ivy and moss. It looked abandoned, no signs of life around it. No footprints, no recent tracks in the dirt. I should have turned back then. I should have gone back to the cabin, closed the door, and forgotten about it. But I didn't. Curiosity got the better of me. I walked up to the shed, pushing aside the overgrown branches to get a better look. The door was slightly ajar. I stood there for a moment, weighing whether I should open it. What was the harm? It was probably just an old storage shed left behind by whoever had built the cabin years ago. But there was something off about it. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, like the place itself was trying to warn me. I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the hinges protesting with a high-pitched squeal. Inside, it was pitch black. I reached for my phone, the only source of light I had, and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing shelves covered in dust and cobwebs. A few rusted tools hung from the walls, long abandoned and forgotten. Nothing that seemed out of place, at first. Then I saw it, a large rectangular shape in the corner of the shed. At first, I thought it was just an old piece of furniture or some kind of storage container, but as I stepped closer, I could see it more clearly. It was a long wooden box, the kind of box that would be used for something valuable, maybe a chest or a crate. It wasn't particularly big, but it was heavy looking, like it was filled with something dense. Something told me not to touch it, but I couldn't resist. I knelt down and ran my fingers along the top. It was cold to the touch. The wood felt smooth, too smooth. I wondered if it had been sealed shut with some kind of varnish or resin. Before I could give it a second thought, the sound of footsteps reached my ears, faint but unmistakable. Someone was walking toward the shed, and they were getting closer. My heart started racing. It wasn't Kyle. I would have heard his truck pull up hours ago. Whoever it was, they were walking in the woods, and I hadn't seen anyone around. I backed away from the box, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had to get out of there, fast. I turned and sprinted back down the trail, not caring to look behind me. My feet stumbled over rocks and tree roots, and I nearly tripped twice, but I didn't slow down. I made it back to the cabin in a panic. I slammed the door shut behind me and bolted it, feeling ridiculous for getting worked up over nothing. But the strange feeling wouldn't leave me. I couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was watching me. Kyle didn't show up that night. I waited, pacing around the cabin, checking the time, hoping he'd arrive before I lost my mind. But as the hours stretched on, I began to feel more and more isolated. The darkness outside seemed to close in on the cabin, and I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. Finally, I heard Kyle's truck pull up around 10 p.m. I rushed outside to meet him, relieved to see a familiar face. He stepped out of the truck, his face pale, eyes wide. "Hey man, you look like you've seen a ghost," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Kyle didn't laugh. He looked at me, his expression serious. "I almost didn't come. I wasn't sure if I should." "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. He paused for a long moment, glancing around at the cabin like he was making sure no one was listening. There's something weird about this place, man. I've been coming up here for years, but I've never felt anything like this before. There's something out there in the woods. I don't know what it is, but I can feel it. I stared at him, unsure of how to respond. The tension between us was palpable. Neither of us was sure what we were dealing with, but I was certain of one thing: whatever it wasn't something I was prepared for. The rest of the weekend went by in a blur. The unease never lifted, and neither of us ventured out into the woods again. We stayed in the cabin, constantly checking the windows and the door, making sure it was locked at all times. But the feeling remained, like we were being watched, like the land around the cabin was alive with something we couldn't understand. When I left on Sunday, I didn't look back. I never returned to that cabin, and I never spoke to Kyle about it again. To this day, I don't know what we encountered out there, but I know I'll never forget that feeling of being so completely, utterly alone. And I don't think Kyle will ever tell me what he saw either. He knows better than to try to explain something like that. Some things are best left unsaid. I was 34 when it happened. It was the fall of 2018, and I had taken some time off work in northern Colorado. I was living in Fort Collins back then, and I'd been working a construction job for over a decade. That year had worn me down pretty hard. Long shifts, sore hands, barely any time to rest. I remember thinking that I needed to just get away for a bit. Not a vacation with people, just quiet, woods, somewhere I could go off the grid and clear my head. I'd found a listing online for a rental cabin about 90 miles southwest of town, somewhere deep in Pike National Forest. The place didn't even show up on Google Maps, just a rough set of directions in the description and a few grainy photos. It was an old log cabin that supposedly used to belong to a hunter back in the 70s, then changed hands a few times over the years. No phone service out there, no Wi-Fi, and the last few miles were on an unpaved road that the owner warned was tough on most cars. That sounded perfect to me. I'd been craving that kind of stillness for a long time. I packed up my truck with a cooler full of food, a few jugs of water, extra batteries, a sleeping bag, and a couple books. I brought my .22 rifle too, not because I planned on hunting, but because being alone in the woods always gave me a little edge. It's just a comfort thing. My dad always said if you're far from town, it's better to have it and not need it. I left on a Thursday morning, around 9 a.m. The drive was peaceful at first. Bright skies, air crisp with that autumn bite. The trees were starting to change, and the winding roads made it feel like I was slowly dropping off the edge of the map. The pavement ended about 12 miles from the cabin, just like the ad said. The dirt road twisted through thick pines, some parts narrowing so much that I had to slow down and dodge branches. My truck was four-wheel drive, and even then I could feel it grinding over rocks and climbing uneven ridges. After a good hour of bouncing down that road, I saw the cabin. It was tucked between two steep hills, the trees clearing just enough to make space for the structure. The thing looked like it had been around since before the state was formed. A dark, weathered log built with a sagging metal roof and a small front porch with uneven steps. One window on the front, two on the side, and an old stovepipe sticking out of the roof. There was a single door with a warped screen that hung loose on its hinge. I parked off to the side and killed the engine. The silence hit me immediately. No cars, no people, not even planes overhead. Just wind, creaking trees, and the occasional rustle of dry leaves. Felt good. I sat there for a few minutes before grabbing my things and walking up to the porch. Inside, the place was even smaller than it looked. One main room with a cot along the back wall, a small table and two chairs near the window, and a rusty old wood stove in the corner. There was a tiny side room that looked like it had once been a pantry, and a rickety ladder led up to a loft space with a slanted ceiling. I could barely stand up in it, but it was dry, and I ended up throwing my sleeping bag up there anyway. The floors creaked with every step. It smelled like dry wood, dust, and the faint scent of something metallic, maybe old tools or the stovepipe. There was no electricity, Just an oil lamp on the table and a pile of firewood beside the stove. After unpacking, I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering kindling and walking the area around the cabin. There was a dried creek bed about 50 yards to the east, and to the north, the woods got thick fast. I saw old boot prints on the trail, but they looked faded, maybe weeks or months old. Nothing fresh. I didn't see or hear anyone else the whole day. That night, I made a small fire in the stove, warmed a can of beans, and listened to the wind scraping against the roof. It wasn't scary at first, just quiet. I stayed up reading until the oil lamp got low, then crawled into my sleeping bag in the loft. I slept okay, all things considered. Woke up once or twice from small noises, but figured it was just branches or animals. The second day was when things started to feel off. I woke up around 6:30 a.m. and climbed down the ladder to boil some water. I stepped out to use the woods and noticed that a small pile of sticks I'd stacked near the back of the cabin had been knocked over. Not a big deal, animals could have done it. But they weren't just scattered, they were laid out in a sort of pattern, almost like a half circle. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Maybe I had just set them down weird the day before. That afternoon, I hiked west into the forest, hoping to find a good lookout point. I followed a narrow game trail up a ridge and ended up on a slope with a decent view of the valley below. I stayed there for about 2 hours. It was peaceful until I heard what sounded like distant crunching. Faint but steady, like footsteps on dry leaves. I waited, thinking maybe it was a deer, but I never saw anything. The sound stopped. I called out, nothing. Then again, I was in the middle of the forest. Sound travels weird out there. I headed back to the cabin and noticed something strange near the front steps. There were scuff marks in the dirt. At first I figured they were mine, but they weren't in the same spot I'd walked. They were near the edge of the cabin, like someone had stood just out of view from the door. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, and the cabin groaned every time a gust rolled through. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit up straight. 3 sharp knocks, slow, deliberate, on the back wall of the cabin. I didn't move for a solid minute. The stove had burned low, casting a dim orange glow on the ceiling. My heart was hammering in my chest. I waited, holding my breath. No more knocks, no footsteps, just silence. I finally climbed down, rifle in hand, and slowly crept to the back door. I opened it. Nothing. Just the dark line of trees. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat in the chair by the stove with my rifle across my lap until the sun came up. On the third day, things got worse. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the trees. That's when I noticed a trail that hadn't been there before. It looked fresh. Leaves brushed aside, small branches bent, curved off into the woods behind the cabin. I followed it for maybe 50 feet before stopping. I found a footprint, not a boot like mine, but a worn sole, thin, almost like an old sneaker. The tread was barely visible. It hadn't been there the day before. I went back inside and stayed close. I kept the rifle loaded. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, knocks. This time from the front porch. 3 slow knocks, then nothing. I waited until sunrise before opening the door. There were no tracks, but the screen door had been nudged open, hanging just a little further than where I'd left it. I made the decision to leave that morning. I packed my things fast, loaded the truck. As I walked around back to check once more, I saw something I'll never forget. Carved into the bark of a tree about 10 feet from the cabin, just low enough to miss if you weren't looking, was a word. Stay. The bark was fresh, the cuts still sticky with sap. Whoever had done that was close, maybe watching me right then. I didn't hesitate. I jumped in the truck and started the engine. The tires spun a little on the soft earth before catching, and I tore out of there, faster than I should have. Even as I drove, I kept checking the mirrors. No one followed, but the feeling didn't go away. I didn't stop until I reached pavement, and even then, I drove another hour before pulling over. I sat there with the engine running, trying to calm down. I never went back. I emailed the owner and told him there were signs of someone messing around near the cabin. He never replied. The listing disappeared a few weeks later. It's been years now, but I still think about it. Not because of the fear, it's the silence. Whoever was out there didn't want to talk. Didn't want to hurt me, at least not right away. They just wanted me to stay. And I wonder what would have happened if I had. I had always wanted to escape the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the never-ending parade of people, the lights that never dimmed. It all wore me down. So, when I got a call from an old friend about a cabin in the middle of nowhere, I didn't hesitate. It sounded like the perfect opportunity for some peace and quiet, a break from everything. The cabin was located in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains. The nearest town, a small place called Greenfield, was about a 2-hour drive away. I'd never been there before, and frankly, I wasn't sure what to expect. All I knew was that it was supposed to be secluded, an ideal spot for someone like me who needed a break from the chaos of daily life. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the winding road that led to the cabin. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the quiet was almost deafening. It was the kind of silence that you didn't realize how much you missed until you were surrounded by it. The kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides, making every sound, no matter how small, seem that much louder. The cabin itself was a modest 2-story building with a steep, sloping roof. It had that rustic charm, made of weathered logs and stone, with a small porch that creaked underfoot. There was no electricity, no phone signal, just the sounds of the forest and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The perfect getaway for someone who wanted to unplug. I stepped out of my car, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. My luggage was light, just a bag with a few clothes and a couple of books. I didn't expect to need much. The whole point of this trip was to disconnect, to get away from everything that had been weighing on me. As I walked up to the cabin, I could feel the weight of the world lifting, even if just for a moment. The key was hidden under a loose stone by the door. I found it without any trouble and let myself inside. The interior was simple but cozy. There was a fireplace along one wall, a couple of old wooden chairs, and a small kitchen with a wooden table that looked like it had seen better days. It was exactly what I needed. I unpacked quickly, tossing my things onto the bed in the small bedroom. The room smelled faintly of wood and dust, but nothing unpleasant. I set up a small camp chair by the window, overlooking the dense trees that surrounded the cabin, and just sat there for a while. The view was incredible, and the silence, though unsettling at first, was beginning to feel like a balm. As night settled in, I decided to light a fire. The cabin came equipped with firewood, and I was happy to stoke the flames, watching as the fire crackled and popped. The warmth was comforting, and it wasn't long before I found myself feeling truly at ease. But then, as I was finishing my dinner, a simple meal of canned beans and rice, I heard something, a rustling, faint but distinct, coming from the woods just outside the cabin. It was odd because, up until that point, the forest had been completely still. No wind, no animals, just an overwhelming silence. But now, the trees seemed to be alive with sound, as if something was moving around just beyond my sight. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. After all, I was in the woods, surrounded by wildlife. But the sound kept going, growing louder. I glanced at the window, but all I could see were shadows that stretched unnaturally long in the dimming light. I stood up from the table, my heart rate quickening. The rustling stopped suddenly, and the silence returned, even more profound than before. I stood there for a few moments, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. There was nothing to fear, I reasoned. I was alone in a cabin in the woods. That's all. But as I sat back down, a thought nagged at me. What if it wasn't an animal? What if it was something else? I tried to push the thought out of my mind, focusing on the fire in front of me. But I couldn't stop glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there. I knew it was ridiculous, but I couldn't help myself. Night settled in completely, and the shadows outside grew deeper. The only light in the cabin came from the fire and the soft glow of the moon filtering through the window. I was exhausted, physically and mentally, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified, every snap of a twig outside louder than it should have been. Around midnight, I heard it again, the rustling. This time, it wasn't just the sound of leaves or branches moving. It was something else, closer, heavier, like someone was walking around the cabin, pacing just outside. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly where I was. I held my breath, listening, hoping it would stop. The silence returned, but it didn't feel like the same silence from earlier. It was too still, too empty. I grabbed the flashlight I had packed and crept toward the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself I was being paranoid, that there was no reason to be scared, but the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. The forest stretched out in every direction, nothing but trees and darkness. The flashlight beam flickered and danced as I scanned the area, half expecting to see a face or figure in the distance. But there was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind, the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. It was just my imagination, I thought. But then I saw it. A footprint. It was barely visible in the dirt near the cabin steps, but it was there, large, deep, and unmistakably human. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone. Someone or something had been out there circling the cabin. I turned back quickly, my mind racing. There was no one in sight, no sounds from the forest, but the feeling of being watched intensified. I bolted inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I paced the room, trying to think rationally. The night dragged on, each minute stretching longer than the last. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made my heart race. I was certain someone had been outside, but who and why? At dawn, the forest outside looked peaceful again, the morning light spilling through the trees. I forced myself to go outside and check the perimeter of the cabin. There were no more footprints, no signs that anyone had been near the cabin since the night before. It was as if the night had never happened, as if I had imagined the whole thing. But I knew better. That afternoon, I decided to pack up and leave. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, the lingering sense that someone had been watching me. The cabin, once a place of escape, had turned into a place of dread. I couldn't stay any longer, not with that feeling gnawing at me. As I drove away, the road winding through the trees, I glanced back in my rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, nestled between the trees, quiet and still. But something was different now. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I would never return. I was 31 when I decided to spend a weekend at my uncle's old hunting cabin. This was in late October 2021, just outside a little town called Mineral Point, Wisconsin. My Uncle Paul had passed away the year before. He left the cabin to my dad, but my dad had no interest in it. It was just sitting out there in the woods, collecting dust. I hadn't been there since I was a teenager, and I figured it might be good for me to get away for a couple of days. I'd been working long hours at my job in Chicago and hadn't really had time to clear my head in months. The thought of being surrounded by trees and fresh air sounded better than sitting in my apartment with traffic noise all night. The plan was simple. Drive up Friday morning, spend the night, maybe two, and just disconnect. I packed some basic stuff: tools, flashlight, camping stove, water, food for 2 days, and my dad's old .38 revolver. I wasn't planning on hunting or anything like that, but I figured it couldn't hurt to have it. There were always stories about coyotes or trespassers, but I didn't think much of it. I've always been more careful than paranoid. It was a 5-hour drive. The roads got more and more empty as I got closer to the cabin. Eventually, the pavement turned into gravel, and the trees thickened on either side. When I finally pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat, it was around 2:30 p.m. The place looked just like I remembered: small, square, made of dark timber, with a tin roof and a porch that sagged a little more than it used to. I parked the truck off to the side and unlocked the cabin. The door creaked like something out of a horror movie, but that was to be expected. Everything inside smelled like dust and pine. There were 2 rooms, main area with a small kitchen and a wood stove, and a back room with 2 beds. The windows were dusty but not broken, and it looked like mice had gotten into a few things. I swept up a bit, unpacked my gear, and started a fire in the stove just to knock the chill out of the place. By 4 p.m., the sun was already starting to dip low. It gets dark early that time of year in Wisconsin. I went out to gather some kindling and walked the edge of the property. The woods were dead silent, just the crunch of leaves under my boots. No birds, no wind, no distant sounds of cars, just empty silence. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake this tight feeling in my chest, like something was off. Maybe I was just too used to the noise of the city. I brought the firewood back, heated up some canned stew, and sat on the porch eating with my coat zipped up to my chin. The sky turned that deep orange, then pink, and finally a steel blue before night dropped hard and fast. I stayed out there a bit too long and ended up needing my flashlight to get back inside. Once I was in for the night, I locked the door and latched the windows, just out of habit. The fire crackled low in the stove. I didn't want to burn through all the wood, so I only fed it a few pieces. I had no cell signal, and the little radio I brought couldn't pick up anything. I sat in a chair with a book for a while, but it was hard to concentrate. Every little sound outside pulled my attention. Creaks in the wood, branches tapping the roof, the occasional shifting of the cabin as it settled in the cold. I went to bed around 9:30 p.m., thinking I'd sleep better with some earplugs, but I left one out just in case. That probably saved me. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. The fire had gone out, and the room was pitch black. I lay still, listening. Then I heard it again, this soft crunch outside. Leaves, then silence. Then again, asterisk crunch star. It wasn't a squirrel or a raccoon. The steps were too slow, too deliberate, heavy. I sat up slowly and held my breath. It sounded like someone was walking around the cabin, circling it, step by step. I grabbed the revolver and stayed completely still. The window near the foot of my bed faced the woods. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel something was out there. Someone. The steps stopped. Then, a sound I'll never forget. Metal tapping on glass. Slow, precise. Someone was tapping on the window in the main room. I didn't move. I just waited. After maybe a full minute of silence, the crunching footsteps started again, moving away this time, back toward the woods. Then nothing. I stayed awake for the next hour, gun in hand, every muscle tight. I couldn't hear anything else. Eventually, around 3 a.m., I forced myself to check the cabin. I lit a lantern, unlocked the bedroom door, and stepped into the main room. The front window had a smudge on it, like someone pressed their face or hand against the glass. I moved to the door and checked the lock. Still latched. I stepped onto the porch. It was freezing. My breath came out in clouds. I panned the lantern across the clearing, then aimed it at the edge of the woods and froze. There were footprints in the frost-covered grass, clear as day. Boot prints. Someone had walked all the way around the cabin and stood at the front window. I followed them with the light. They stopped maybe 15 feet from the tree line, where the ground was still visible in the moonlight. Then they just disappeared. No turnaround marks, no trail leading away, just gone. I backed into the cabin and locked the door again. The rest of the night I stayed up, just listening. Nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more tapping. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even brush my teeth. I loaded everything into the truck and took one last look at the footprints in the frosted grass. I followed them again in daylight. They still ended the same way, just stopped mid-step, like the person who made them vanished into thin air. But I know that's not possible. There's no such thing, so I kept looking. That's when I noticed something else. A tree just inside the woods had markings on it. Knife marks, carved deep into the bark. Letters and numbers. May 1998. He deserved it. That made my stomach twist. I snapped a photo with my phone even though I didn't have a signal. I didn't want to leave without some proof. I never told my dad. I never told anyone really, except my girlfriend. The sheriff's department said they'd check it out, but I never heard back. That night scared the hell out of me, not because I saw a ghost or heard voices, but because it was real. Somebody was out there. Someone walked up to that cabin in the middle of the night, knowing someone might be inside. I looked up old newspapers later that month. In May 1998, a man named Raymond Lacey was found dead near that same area. He'd been shot once in the head. The case was ruled a hunting accident. Nobody was ever arrested. Maybe it was an accident, or maybe someone thought he deserved it. I never went back to that cabin. My dad eventually sold it to a guy who wanted to fix it up. I didn't care what he did with it. I just wanted it gone. To this day, I still check the windows before I sleep. I still keep the revolver next to my bed. And sometimes, when I wake up at night and the world is dead quiet, I swear I can still hear that slow, heavy crunch of footsteps just outside my window. But now I always keep both earplugs out.